Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We are back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, so let's just get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience in order to keep the broadcast network operating. So, if you're not already over at the libertyworksradionetwork.com website, listening through the online radio link, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the libertyworksradionetwork.com website and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $15, $20 a month. Every membership counts, and we do need your support to keep the network operating. And if you want to get fully informed and educated and get assistance in dealing with the federal income tax, the IRS, and the DOJ in court, you want to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading and get educated. And if you need help answering any IRS correspondence or answering the Department of Justice in court, that's over at irszoom.com. Right, well, you know where it is, irszoom.com, where you can get affordable help answering the IRS and the DOJ in court, because after the Moore Supreme Court decision in 2024, the federal government no longer has the ability to argue credibly or truthfully in court for the income tax or for any of its assessments that are made for the federal personal income tax. I'm not talking about ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. I'm talking about the personal income tax, which of course has been a constitutional fraud since World War II. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, you need to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading, because the government, the DOJ, and the lower courts have been lying to you for 70 years, just flat out lying to you and forcing you to practice communism, literally communism. And we're going to look at that tonight, but specifically the income tax, a graduated income tax, class warfare system based on creating classes of persons and treating them differently under the law, totally unconstitutional. That's what's in the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. A heavy, graduated, or progressive income tax. A heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find graduated taxation, class legislation, class warfare, and the taxing of all the revenues of the people. It's in the Communist Manifesto. It's not in the Constitution. And that's the fraud, that they've lied to you about the 16th Amendment for 70 years. It's impossible for the 16th Amendment to do anything because there's no enabling enforcement clause in it to constitutionally authorize Congress to write any new law, to administer to or enforce any new or allegedly new taxing power allegedly created by the amendment. No new powers, neither direct and without limitation, which has been the erroneous assertion by the lower courts and the IRS for 70 years, nor indirectly, because of income, or added as a fourth power to tax indirectly to the three existing powers of impost, duty, and excise. If income were a fourth power, that again would require an enabling enforcement clause in the amendment to allow Congress to write law to administer to and enforce the new power to tax indirectly income, separate from the authorities to tax foreign persons, foreign activity, foreign imports, and in foreign places by impost, to tax exported goods by duty, and to tax commodities, licenses, and corporations by excise. You'll notice that in the impost, duty, and excise taxing powers, there is no authority to tax the labor of the American people. Imposts tax foreign persons. Duties tax export. Excises tax corporations. where everything the corporation earns is earned through the privilege of incorporation, and it is the privilege that is the subject of the excise taxation, or rather the object of the taxation. And citizens aren't subject to that excise because they don't earn money by virtue of any federally granted privilege. They earn money through the exercise of their right to work, and their right to have and accumulate private property through private transactions within the states without federal interference or any direct taxation of either or neither their labor nor their earnings, redefined as income. There's no indirect basis, impost, duty, or excise, for taxing rent unless it's earned by a foreign person or a corporate person or a licensed person. There's no indirect basis for taxing interest, dividends, commissions, annuities, alimony, wages, salaries, compensation. None of these sources are inherently subject to taxation by impost, duty, and excise because they don't derive from a transaction or activity subject to impost, duty, or excise, and they're not conducted by a person subject to any such taxation: the corporate person, the foreign person, the licensed person. The whole entire system of taxing the American people's labor is a constitutional fraud, and it runs all the way to Social Security, which is also a constitutional fraud because it's an unauthorized tax, constitutionally speaking. It's neither impost, duty, or excise. And I've reviewed the fact that is revealed by the statutes themselves implementing the tax. Because when you review the statutes, you find that the statute that imposes the employer's half of the Social Security tax plainly says that it's an excise that's imposed on the employer. But when you go over and read the other half of the same tax that's imposed on the employee, the word excise is removed. It says it's an income tax. So, well, what is that? An impost, a duty, or an excise? It's not an excise, or they wouldn't have removed it. That means it's either an impost or a duty, since there is no such thing as an income tax separate from the impost, duty, or excise, because income is not the object of the tax. It's not the subject of the taxation. It's the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on the revenues derived from the federally taxable activity subject to some indirect taxation under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 by impost, duty, or excise. How much tax is owed as an impost, duty, or excise? We measure it with income. The profits derived from the taxable activities conducted by the taxable person. There is no taxing of everything you make if there's no impost, duty, or excise that applies to the earnings. And there is none that applies to your labor. There is none that applies to rent you may collect from someone who rents a bedroom in your home in order to attend the nearby university. There is none. There's no authority to tax the dividend except at the corporate level. They could tax the corporation's paying of a dividend, but they can't tax you receiving it, regardless of the fact that it came from a taxable corporation. Once they pay it to you, it's private property, and the federal government can't touch it. The whole thing is a fraud. And it all started with Social Security in the 30s, where they knew they had a problem because labor isn't taxable. So the Supreme Court had to write decisions that inferred it was all okay without ever addressing it. They did this in Stewart Machine, 1937, where the court held, oh, it's okay to tax the employer on his employment so they can collect Social Security. I'm sorry, what about the other half of the tax? What about collecting it from the employee? What about directly taxing the labor of the American citizens? Oh, they didn't address that. No employees were involved in the suit. No one had standing. So that issue didn't get raised. The only issue that got raised was whether or not the company had to pay it. And they do, because that's legitimate. You can tax the corporate activities, but you can't tax the citizens. And I don't think there's ever been a decision that addressed this. It's just all been fraudulently inferred and then rubber stamped into de facto operations through World War II, where they did in fact impose a direct tax on the labor of the American people through the victory tax. And that was the first time the labors of the American people were taxed by the federal government. It didn't happen in 1913. That was a tax that was collected from foreign persons and was imposed on all persons in the territories and possessions earning money. It was never a domestic tax. It was never a direct tax. It was never an unlimited tax. All of these assertions by the lower courts were treasonous sedition, where the courts, having been educated in liberal colleges and liberal law schools, decided to begin enforcing their liberal socialist philosophies instead of the constitutional provisions they took an oath to uphold. So you have a victory tax. That was a direct tax on the labor of all American people and totally unconstitutional. But if you objected to it, what are you, a Nazi or a Jap? So they lock you up in the Japanese internment camps. That put an end to that protest, right? Yeah. So nobody protests. And when the victory tax expired and nobody had challenged it, Congress decided they couldn't let that power die because in the 2 years they had the victory tax, they paid off like 90% of the World War II debt. They thought they were going to be paying that debt for 75 years. And in fact, a couple of nations in Europe, I think England, made their last debt payment back in 2014. They were paying it for 70 years. But we didn't, because the income tax let us tap the labors of the American people, who were all conscripted, or the companies rather, were all conscripted to produce goods to support the war. So if you wanted a job, you were working at a company that was supporting the war. Remember now, you had victory gardens, you had rationing of nearly everything for World War II. So all of the industry, all of the business that was conducted was basically focused on producing for the war effort. And everybody got conscripted into that. And you can have a debate about whether or not that's proper or not, or good or right, but they attached themselves to the salaries of everybody in the country for 2 years. We won World War II. The victory tax expired. Congress looked around and said, holy smoke, we just paid off the debt. We got to keep this going. So they reenacted, or they enacted the current system absent any tax imposed. They just set up a system where the employee is duped into asking his employer to withhold tax on a W-4 when no tax is imposed and no tax is owed. And in fact, no tax is ever deposited in the Treasury after the withholding of tax, which is required by law, but for some reason doesn't happen. And that's why you have to file a return, because no tax has been paid. But the law says it should have been paid at the end of the year, and there should have been a record recording your payment of the tax. How come there's no tax paid with all the money taken from your paycheck? How come there's no record of it? Okay, I hear that first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back in more. Tell your friends, neighbors, relatives, family, and business associates to listen in and get educated. Okay, this is Thomas Frieda on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into this. When we picked up that first segment, I didn't mean to go right into the tax rant for the whole segment. Let's step back and go through some of the current events that are occurring. Spend a few minutes doing this. It seems like once again, Donald Trump was out in front of the world on this Greenland issue. There's a big meeting in Davos of the World Economic Forum, and of course he's there. And within the first 2 days of the forum, he's already worked out a framework for a deal with NATO and Greenland and Norway. So once again, Trump was ahead of the rest of the world on this. Everybody was yelling and screaming, and when he threatened to put tariffs in, the market fell 1,000 points. Now, of course, as soon as he announced the deal, the market recovered and it's right back again. So the markets are just overreacting to these threats. Donald Trump is not doing these things because he wants to tariff these folks. He wants them to come to the table and negotiate. And they are. So he's secured, we haven't heard the deal yet, but it sounds like he's secured a deal for America to have access to, use of, Greenland for national defense, military base, and mineral extraction purposes, which is big. I mean, you don't realize it because when you look at the globe or maps, you don't see the relationship on the map between America, Russia, and China. You don't see that relationship looking across the top of the Arctic. But when you see that depiction of the map, it's quite clear that if there was an attack from either of those nations, it would come across the Arctic and Greenland. And our best position for preventing or addressing that is to have military installations and facilities in Greenland guarding against that gateway over the top of the earth down onto New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Boston, and the other cities that are in the northern half of the U.S., which is what will be targeted coming over the Arctic. So, again, he was ahead of that, and apparently he's got the deal. And today, the markets were both back up again. The Dow was again approaching 50,000, and the NASDAQ is over right around 23, I think. So that's happening. We'll have to wait and see what comes out of the deal. And of course, Trump is at Davos bragging that America has turned around the economic engine, and the numbers appear to support him. The price of oil is down $60. Gasoline is below $3, below $2 in a number of states around the country. There's a lot of infrastructure money that's been committed to build out, which will create jobs. And the last 3 months of the inflation data show an annualized 2.3%. Now, that's not quite the 1.6 that was in place when Trump left office and Joe Biden took over and destroyed the economy and the economic engine of the U.S., but 2.3 is bringing it down. It pretty much means the inflation beast has been tamed, and if we can keep energy prices low, competition should start to bring food prices back again, at least a little bit, provided they can deal with the trucking issues, which appear to be becoming a problem in California. Okay, so what else we got? ICE in Minnesota, of course, they're trying to arrest and kick out criminals, fraudsters, and other problematic individuals. And the liberals, of course, are arguing, fighting, and protesting to keep the criminals in America, to keep the thieves here, to keep the rapists here, and to keep the fraudsters here, because who else will vote for the Democrats if they don't let them steal the money and buy their votes with the fraud? And now the fraud is billions and billions. It's over 10. And of course, it's going to go much higher because it's not just the daycare where the fraud is occurring. The fraud is occurring in transportation services and all health and nursing services. All the ancillary services are also all being set up as fraudulent operations. And it's being done by a certain group of members in the Somali community who are taking advantage of every single loophole they can to get federal money to supposedly run a taxi service to help people get to the doctor, or to run a daycare service where two sisters with 4 kids each become their own daycare center to take care of her sister's kids. And they get paid $150 a day for 4 kids, $600 a day, $3,000 a week, $12,000 a month, $150,000 a year to take care of your sister's 4 kids instead of yours. And they're both doing it. And then, of course, you have the auto services that are Uber and taxi. They're supposed to take people to and from doctors and so forth. That doesn't exist either. They just bill. They just bill. Nobody goes to the doctor. They just bill. So the whole thing is a fraud. And it's not just in Minnesota. The Medicare fraud in Florida is huge. Medicare fraud, all sorts of fraud in California. It's got to be huge. And they know where it's occurring. It all comes out that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who has basically been forced to drop his re-election campaign because of the work this kid Nick Shirley did exposing all the fraud in the daycare centers and the other operations as well. This kid literally terminated Walz's political career. This was the guy they had up for vice president 10 months ago on the Democrat side. And now he's gone because it's quite clear he and the other higher elements in the Minnesota Democrat government knew about the fraud, buried it, and allowed it to continue and grow. Because once the other side realizes they're being allowed, it grows. They do more. Oh, yeah, and should we mention the leftists that invaded the church services? I'm not sure where this occurred, but Don Lemon was there with a bunch of radicals, invaded a church service and harassed the parishioners during church. And Don Lemon's on TV talking about the right to public free speech and to protest. But what a moron this guy is. What a moron. Your right to peacefully assemble in public to protest does not include your right to invade private property, get in people's faces and harass them. That is criminal behavior. It's disturbing the peace and charging into and interrupting a church service. Well, based on what's happened not too far in the past, fairly recently, it could almost qualify as terrorism. I don't think it does so in this case because it doesn't appear as though there were any guns involved or weapons, and that would seem to me to be a necessary element for terrorism, but it's certainly an invasion of privacy. And if you're going to tolerate that kind of activity, it won't be long before they do have weapons and somebody does get hurt. So the Justice Department needs to go after this nonsense wherever the protests are not peaceful or not assembling in public areas, but rather trying to invade private events or private facilities. You simply don't get to do that. That's not the way free speech or the right to peaceably assemble to protest, to petition the government. That's not the way either one of those rights work. Your right ends where it begins to invade the rights of others. Your right doesn't override theirs, especially not in private property. Oh, yeah, one last thing. It seems like the liberals want Maduro put back in Venezuela, if you can even believe that. No kings, no kings. Put the dictator back in office. Oh, my God. Are these people really that stupid that they can't remember what they did yesterday and contradict it with new claims today? This is 1984. It's as Orwellian as you get. It's as Orwellian as you get. Oh my God. Okay, so let's go back to talking about the federal income tax. Well, actually, let's talk about the liberal judges and their treasonous sedition in throwing the American people under the bus by enforcing literally communism in place of constitutional taxation by impost, duty, and excise, because those are the only three taxing powers granted by the Constitution that are made enforceable at law by a constitutionally authorized Congress that is authorized by the Enabling Enforcement Clause that authorizes Congress to write law for the powers granted. And since there is no enabling enforcement clause in the 16th Amendment, it's impossible for the amendment to be the source of any new power to tax. And that's the fraud that has been foisted off on the American people by the seditious, treasonous federal judges who are betraying the American people and betraying the Constitution and betraying their oath to uphold the Constitution in order to enforce their failed, catastrophic, murderous socialist philosophy of the Communist Manifesto. Why murderous? How many people were murdered by China in converting to communism? 40 million at the least. How many people were murdered by Russia in its conversion to communism? 20 million at least. The count for the murdered by governments converting to communism is over 100 million through the last 100 years. It has never worked, and it never will, because it's a system of theft and graft and corruption, where productivity is punished and robbed, and sloth is rewarded, where ignorance is rewarded, where violence and criminal activity is allowed, so that the people will constantly be crying out to the government for more government to stop the violence they're allowing. Want proof? Take a look at Minnesota, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Chicago. Do I really need to list them all? I don't think so. So, what exactly is the underlying philosophical beliefs of these crooked criminal judges lying to America and stealing your freedom and allowing the government to steal your paycheck and your private property and your prosperity? First plank, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. That's what Mamdani wants to do in New York, right? Fortunately, we haven't had this plank put into place yet, other than the taxation of property by the states with property taxes, which a lot of people feel is theft. You bought the home, why should you be paying the state for rent? That's a separate debate, but a lot of states depend on property tax to operate. Whether or not the elderly should be given a break so that you never tax an elderly person off of his home unless it's worth millions and it's time to go. But you shouldn't be taxing people out of their $50,000, $60,000 home that they lived in for 30 years. But now the taxes have gone sky high. So that's the first step in confiscating, is having a system of property tax that becomes unbearable. But that first plank, I'll give them a break. We haven't got this one yet. Plank 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Well, that's pretty clear, right? We've got the heavy progressive graduated income tax. It goes as high as 40%. You have a graduated system of class warfare that breaks the American people into different classes and then has different law for each class, which creates a system of class warfare, the wealthy against the poor against the wealthy. And what do we see playing out on our streets today? Oh yeah, that class warfare system every single day. And where are the classes defined? That's right, in the tax brackets of Section 1. We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into this. When the commercial break came up, I was discussing the fact that the second plank of the Communist Manifesto is, quote, a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax, close quote. That's where you find graduated taxation, class warfare, class legislation, class division. Let the population fight amongst themselves in the different classes, and they'll never notice it's the political class destroying the country and looting the treasury by passing it out to their friends and relatives and political supporters, who, as we see in Minnesota, then funnel the money right back to the candidate as political contributions, which is what happened to Walz and Ilhan there. They were both getting money back from the people that were defrauding the government to the tune of millions. They were then turning around and contributing hundreds of thousands to the candidates. That allowed them to defraud the government. It's almost like they were co-conspirators in the plan to defraud the government social support programs. So, heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. The Constitution, of course, does not allow for graduated taxation of the American people. Taxation of the American people has to be uniform. You can't treat the Jews one way and the Christians another, or the blacks or the whites, or the young or the old, or the gay or the straight, or the man or the woman, or the Italian or the Irish, or the wealthy or the poor. You can't have different rates of tax for different classes of citizens. They've gotten away with it for 75 years because of the theoretical concept of geographical uniformity in place of intrinsic uniformity. Intrinsic uniformity means it has to be the same for every single person. Geographical uniformity means it has to only be the same in all 50 states. And this ruling, of course, came about in the 1880s when citizens weren't part of the power to tax. They weren't subject to any federal taxes. That doesn't come until the 16th Amendment, remember? So geographical is okay, which means that if a corporation earns $10 million selling alcohol, it can be taxed at a higher rate than a corporation earning $10,000. One can be taxed at 5%, the other can be taxed at 15 or 20 or whatever Congress writes. And it's all okay because it's not uniform, but it's geographically uniform, meaning the same rules will apply to all corporations in all 50 states. And that has been inferred to apply to the individual citizen, which is nonsense because that violates the uniformity provision. And if you allow geographical uniformity to be the controlling limitation with respect to citizens, that opens the door to Congress taxing Jews at 90% and Christians at 5%, Islam's at 100%, and Methodists at 5%, or the blacks at 5% and the whites at 90%, or the Irish at 30% and the Italians at 50%. And it's all perfectly fine for Congress to discriminate against these different classes of citizens as long as it's geographically uniform. So you can justify a tax of 90% on the Jews and the Islams and only 5% on the Christians. And it's perfectly okay as long as all the Jews, Muslims, and Christians in New York, California, Florida, Texas, etc., are all treated the same. So as long as you discriminate against the Jews in every single state, it's perfectly okay to discriminate against them. And that's effectively what the tax rate does, doesn't it? They're taxing the wealthy at a higher rate. Isn't that what happens to most Asians and Jews? So yeah, they're discriminating unconstitutionally. The fact that you have these different rates is what's created the class warfare system, tearing America apart, playing out in our streets. You have to get rid of the graduated tax with respect to citizens. It's destroying the country and driving us to socialist communism. Because the poor will always vote for the government passing out more money. But you're not sharing the wealth, you're destroying it. Wealth only exists as an accumulated asset which can be leveraged to do more business or build more structure or infrastructure or export or import. When you take that capital and pass it all out and let it all get spent on cigarettes, alcohol, going out to dinner, and other addictions, you haven't shared the wealth, you've destroyed it. It no longer exists as an accumulation of wealth. It can be leveraged by the people who understood wealth and understood how to leverage it to do more business, rather than the people that only understand how to drink a bottle of whiskey in 3 days. One day, I'm sorry, I don't drink much. So the income tax, as a graduated tax, is completely unconstitutional. It's virtual communism, and it is destroying the country. That's where the heart of the class warfare system begins, because that's where the classes are defined in law to be treated differently. It's got to end. And I think the Supreme Court has already ended it. They just haven't told you. I don't know why I'm the only person in the country that understands that when the Supreme Court says income taxes are indirect taxes and direct taxes must be apportioned to the states, how come nobody else understands that terminates the current de facto enforcement operations of enforcing the income tax as a non-apportioned direct tax? They just said it's not direct, it's indirect. And if it were direct, it would have to be apportioned to the states. So God knows what the American people have been paying. But it sure isn't any tax, is it? No, I'll tell you what it is. It's peonage debt service. That's why there's no record of tax being paid as a result of all the money withheld from your paycheck all year long to make you file to pay tax, when it's already been collected and should have been paid. It didn't go to the Treasury. That's why there's no record. That's why there's no tax that's paid. It all goes to the Federal Reserve Bank. It's a peonage debt service system. The American people have been conscripted into laboring to collateralize the $38 trillion in debt. And the bank is the only institution that benefits from the collection of income tax from the American people. Because there is no income tax on the American people. Doesn't exist. It's a fraud perpetrated by the federal judges. And the Supreme Court, for some reason, allowed it to occur for 60 years. Of course, this is the same court that gave us Roe v. Wade, that nonsense, that gave us affirmative action, that nonsense, that gave us Chevron and regulatory deference, and that nonsense. And Korematsu, oh, let's just lock up all the Japanese. Because we can't trust them. Totally unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court did it. And it's the same court, the same group of people, the same thinking, the same liberal philosophy that gave you the direct tax, regulatory deference, affirmative action. Let's divide the people in as many ways as we can, and then let the regulatory bureaucracy write its own law to step in and rule over the class warfare. And that's how you got all these federal agencies accumulating the power in arenas that should be state arenas. Education, agriculture, energy, housing, transportation, environmental protection, occupational safety. None of this is in the Constitution. They're all they're all state arenas, not federal. And the fact that the Fed has stepped in and taken over them has happened because the Fed has unlimited access to the capital that you're collateralizing at the Federal Reserve Bank, and the states don't have access to that capital, so they can't do everything needed. and they have to go begging to the Fed. It doesn't give them money unless the state adapts the federal central government planning. In education, let's dumb down the citizens with new math and gender dysphoria. We'll make sure they know all about gender and that they can't read a goddamn word or multiply 4 times 8. I guess we should move on to the next plank, since we're running out of time. 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. So you can't inherit money. No wealth passes from generation to generation. The state steps in and takes it. Mamdani wants to do that too. No generational wealth transfer. The state steals it all. That's socialism. Steal it. Pass it out. So you get voted back in to steal more from the next successful person. Plank 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. They're not talking about the convicted to make them pay for their crimes. They're talking about the accused. Anyone who's accused, confiscate every asset they have so they can't hire an attorney to defend themselves. That makes them an easy victim in court. They'll have to plea out and spend the next 8 years in jail instead of risking 40. Fraudulent extortion in your criminal prosecution system. That's what drives government prosecution, extortion. Plank 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Now, don't get confused here by Marx's use of the word state. He doesn't mean a state as in one of the 50 states. He means a state as in the central government. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Now, why does that sound familiar? Oh, you mean like the Federal Reserve Bank. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Yeah, just like the Federal Reserve Bank. A private operation with a monopoly on currency and credit. Where'd that come from? The 5th plank of the Communist Manifesto. How do they fund it? With the 2nd plank. Stealing the revenues of the people to fund the operation of the bank and keep the debt running forever, or at least until the people get fed up and sick and tired of playing peon and being robbed, lied to, and told to shut up, sit down, and do as you're told, you slave, you peon. How dare you think you have rights under the Constitution? Where have you been for 50 years? Aren't you paying attention? 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Oh, you mean like the DOT and the FCC. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. You mean like the Department of Agriculture, getting control over all the growing. 8, equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Oh, that's forced relocation and minimum wage. Equal liability of all. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. There's your forced relocation. 10, free education for all children in public schools. They mean free indoctrination with propaganda, not education. The state doesn't educate, it indoctrinates. It doesn't want educated, intelligent people with critical, independent thinking skills. It wants slaves that will service the debt for their entire lives and never bitch. Combination of education with industrial production. Oh, you teach the kids child labor. Don't bother to educate them. We'll be back next week with more.